What an enthusiastic, what an enthusiastic way to begin the program. You've taken all the zap out of my words now with that enthusiasm. How can I compete with this man? How can I come and say anything after this has been said in that way? Jazakumullah khair for the introduction. So, it's great that you started by talking about the fact that an interesting question to ask would be whether God is one or many. Because this is a fundamental question of Tawheed or monotheism, which is an important consideration. But before one talks about God, one must define God, and God is known through his attributes. Many a time when we speak to atheists, we encounter the objection that how can it be the case that you guys are always putting God into the gaps? They call it the God of the gaps argument. What is God? Who is God? God is known through the attributes that he describes himself with from a textual perspective, or that we get to know of through rationalization, discursion, intellection, understanding. And those who have attended the seminar with me, we went through some very interesting arguments for God's existence, which are rationally based, teleological arguments, cosmological arguments, contingency arguments, and so on. And with these arguments, the aim is not to show that God exists in the conventional religious way, but it's to show that an entity exists with X, Y, and Z attributes. That power exists, that intelligence exists, that knowledge exists, and so on. And through this intellection and this rationalization, we also find that it's not possible to conceive of, for instance, 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 almighties. You can't have more than one all-powerful agent. Because by definition, an all-powerful agent is one which is more powerful than everything else. So how can you have 2 of those? You can't have more than one independent agent. Because by definition, an independent agent is something which doesn't depend on anything else. And so it's only possible to have one independent sovereign agent. So we realize that rationally speaking, the idea of a monotheistic, a respectable monotheism, is the only rationally understood idea from a process of rationalization. You cannot come to a rational conclusion, a logical conclusion, that many gods exist. And we also talked in the seminar about the Quranic arguments for the oneness of God. Like, for instance, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, لو كان فيهما آلهة إلا الله لفسدتا فسبحان الله رب العرش عما يصفون. That if there were in them, i.e. the heavens and the earth, any other God other than God, then they would have been destroyed. Why? Because there cannot be more than one ultimate will controlling the teleological events of the universe. Think about it. If there was more than one ultimate will, which will would supersede which? There must be some kind of struggle that would be entailed from that reality, which would mean that the universe itself would cease to exist in an orderly state. This is the Quranic argument. And we talked about the other argument in the Quran. لَعَلَى بَعْضُهُمْ عَلَى بَعْضٍ. In chapter 23 of the Quran, verse 91. Surah Al-Mu'minun. Where Allah says, if there were more than one God, they would have tried to outstrip one another. So the Quran not only offers rational arguments for respectable monotheism, but demonstrates through vivid analogy that it's not actually conceivable to think of more than one God. once that's said now, the question is, do we actually need all of that anyways? Because the reality is this. The reality is our understanding, our knowledge of God, our knowledge of God is actually immediate knowledge. It's immediate knowledge. We know God. We know God without having any rational arguments put to us whatsoever. We know God by virtue of existing. And there have been interesting studies that have been done, which can be cited in 2011, for example. The Oxford University had a multidisciplinary study, and they come to that conclusion. They said that when we looked at children, and they're born in a certain way, that they actually believe in a deity, even before the process of socialization. So in other words, this is not something which they have been socially conditioned to believe in. And that's why there is an interesting cross-cultural reality of the belief in a deity. You're not naturally inclined to believe in non-existence of God. You naturally believe in God. René Descartes interestingly put this. He said, and we don't put it in this way, but he put it in this way. He said that we're all born with the autograph of God on us, with this intuition, with this immediate knowledge. And the Quran says, in describing why and how that is the case, well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says in the Quran, He says, but أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم, says, وَإِذْ أَخَذَ رَبُّكَ مِنْ بَنِي آدَمَ مِنْ ظُهُورِهِمْ ذُرِّيَّتَهُمْ وَأَشْهَدَهُمْ عَلَىٰ أَنفُسِهِمْ أَلَسْتُ بِرَبِّكُمْ قَالُوا بَلَىٰ شَهِدْنَا أَن تَقُولُوا يَوْمَ الْقِيَامَةِ إِنَّا كُنَّا عَنْ هَٰذَا غَافِلِينَ. Allah says in the Quran, He says that there was a state in which Allah, He took from Bani Adam, from their backs. This is chapter 7 of the Quran, verse 172. He took their progeny. He took their progeny. How this is the case is elaborated in the state. And that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He told the souls, do you take me as your master? Alastu bi rabbikum? Am I not your master? قالوا بَلَا شَهِدْنَا. They said, certainly we testify to that reality. What reality is that? The reality that you are our master. And then Allah, He says, أَن تَقُولُوا يَوْمَ الْقِيَامَةِ إِنَّا كُنَّا عَنْ هَذَا غَافِلِينَ. That this would, you can't say now on the Day of Judgment that we were upon this heedless. In other words, we're not heedless of the fact, we cannot be heedless of the fact that God exists. The one God, the Master God, the Rabb. Because this is something which has been instilled into us before our physical existence, before our existence, before our natural existence, before we were babies. And that impetus to believe in God, that inclination to believe in God, was something which was as natural to us as our instinct towards our mothers. You could say it's even more natural than that. Let's give an example to make this a bit more vivid. Say for instance you have a child, young child, maybe the age of 6 months, baby, and this baby is obviously attached to his mother, and the baby grows up to maybe the age of 2 years old or something, and it's with his mother, and then somehow the baby breaks away from his mother or from her mother. They have to go somewhere else. When the baby is reunited with the mother, one could argue that they will have an inclination to that mother, because they know it's almost like it's a hidden memory. It's a hidden memory. It's something which is nestled into the thoughts of that particular child. But all that is required is a few adjustments, and that baby or that then child would recognize their mother. And the same thing, or the same analogy, can be drawn with our subjective states in the world around us. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He has positioned us in a certain way where we already know who Allah is. SubhanAllah, say that one more time. We already know who Allah is. You don't need any information. To know your relationship with Allah is a natural relationship. It's a natural relationship. Like the baby naturally knows the mother. It's a natural maternal connection that can only be severed by force or by circumstance or by the process of socialization, which is exactly what the Prophet Muhammad alluded to when he said, which is a hadith in Sahih Muslim and Bukhari of Abu Hurairah, where he says, كل مولود يولد على الفطرة. Every mawlud, every born child is born on the primordial predisposition of believing in God, the fitrah. فطرة الله التي خلق الناس عليها لا تبديل لخلق الله, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said to the Rum, that this is the fitrah of Allah that He created the human beings in, and that you will not find an alteration, a change in the way Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala creates His creatures. So we know Allah by virtue of existence. The question is then, why does the Quran say وَمَا كُنَّا مُعَذِّبِينَ حَتَّى نَبْعَثَ رَسُولًا? We were not going to punish them until we send them a messenger. This is Surah Al-Isra, chapter number 17, verse 15. By the way, I just saw Zakir Naik. I just met him, that's why I was a little bit late. And I'm acting like him now with the, chapter number, verse number, yes? I had about an hour and a half meeting with him, and now I'm acting like Zakir Naik. Yes. So, but why is it the case though? You see, that Allah then needs to send messengers and prophets. If the situation was one where there was an initial recognition of who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was, why do we need messengers and prophets? Don't worry, it's a rhetorical question. You'll have your chance to ask your real questions. In the question and answer session, we have Sheikh Mohammed Hijab who's coming up and answering the questions with us. Fiqh-related questions area and hadith-related things. Inshallah, he'll help us with that. But the answer is this. It's because, as the Arabs say, إِنَّمَا سُمِيَ الْإِنسَانِ إِنسَان لِكَثْرَةِ نِسْيَانِهِ. Like the human being was called insan, which comes from the Arabic word nisyan, because of the frequent forgetfulness of his nature. So the fact that we're human beings entails almost that we will forget. So that process of socialization, where the Prophet then told us in the hadith, his parents will make him into a Jew, his parents will make him into a Christian, his parents will make him into a Magian. That's primary socialization. But you can extend that. The society can make us into atheists. The society can make us into liberals. The society can make us into feminists. Not that feminism and liberalism is totally wrong, and we'll come to that on Thursday, okay? But it's a process of socialization. We have certain social attitudes and beliefs that had we been born and raised in a different time and a different place, surely we would not have those beliefs. So that process of socialization is what moves the human being away from believing in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in the purity of his monotheism, and recognizing that contract that you had initially with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You know, one thing I've been looking into and I found quite interesting, and I'm thinking that maybe you will find quite interesting as well, after I let you wait here in suspense. Yes, and this might seem like it's completely not related to what we're talking about today. Don't worry, it is. It's the idea of contract. I was recently having a discussion with some liberals about prostitution. What did you say? What are you talking about, man? We're talking about what you never knew about God. Why are you talking about prostitution? Let me tell you why. They were basically asking me, why is prostitution wrong? And obviously from an Islamic perspective, we're saying it's haram because, you know, you can't have sexual intercourse before marriage and so on. Yes? Smart brother. You can't. But obviously, if you're speaking to someone who does not believe in your worldview, I have to explain it to them in their worldview, right? So I said, the reason why prostitution is wrong on liberalism is because safe, and by the way, this is not why it's wrong in Islam. It's wrong in Islam for قال الله وقال الرسول, okay? But I was answering that question and I was thinking about it as I was saying. On liberalism, the problem is, a lot of it is based on consent and contract, yeah? So if let's say a client, and this is going to sound very crude, I do apologize. A client wants to use the services of a prostitute. And he pays the woman, or the man, yes? Yeah, there are no prostitutes. And he pays the woman, or he pays the man. Say, let's say for the sake of argument, how much is it usually for? This is a true question, this is a true question. If anyone answered that question, we would, yes. Let's say it's £50. I don't know how much, ringgits, or whatever you have it. What would you have this country? What's your currency here?
Ringgit.
Whatever it may be, right? Now, say for instance the woman agrees. And during the act, she says, no, stop. Like during the act, she says, stop. Now there's a problem here. The problem is he paid that money. But at any point, based on the law and other reasons, human rights, she could say, don't touch me, please don't do this. And if he continues, it actually could be rape. She can accuse him of rape. I say that's actually not fair from a liberal perspective because the contract is broken. He's paid her money and she didn't deliver the service. But if she does deliver the service, it will hurt her. So you can never have a contract like that. It's avoidable and it's not a regulatable thing. And the same thing could be said about surrogacy, by the way. You know, like IVF. If you say to someone, well, you could be the mother of my child, but you're the surrogate mother, yes? But that woman gives birth to the child. If they make a contract, I'm going to give you X amount of money for that child. But then the woman who gives birth to the child decides, I don't want to give this child away. This actually happened in America, and they ruled in favor of the surrogate mother. They said that she didn't have full information, and therefore she has a right to keep that child, even though the sperm was of another man and the egg was of another woman. So it messes up the contract. Surrogacy, therefore, on liberalism, on contract theory, is problematic, and so is prostitution. It's just an argument, just in case anyone tries to, right? But the idea is this: why am I talking about contract? And why am I made that diversion? The reason is this: there is something which unifies, yes, Western thought and Islamic thought, and it is the idea of contract. It is the idea of contract. The Quran says, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu awfu bil uqud. Oh, you who believe, fulfill the contracts. And in liberal theory, one of the underpinning things is go and make sure that you fulfill the contract. Because it's so obvious that chaos would ensue. Listen carefully. Chaos would ensue if contracts are not abided by. Imagine you have peace treaties between countries and revoked straight away because contracts are not respected. Contracts are important on everyone's worldview, on our worldview and on their worldview. Why is that important? Because imagine, listen carefully, what is the consequence, according to them, of rupturing a contract?
Anarchy.
Yeah, you can have anarchy, but usually the law has in place legal consequences, yes? If the law has in place legal consequences which can range from prison sentence to fining to death, in the case of treason, the idea that there should be a consequence attached to a severing of a contract is universally understood, almost, except with anarchists and other people, right? But imagine this, imagine we, as human beings, are severing a contract with the ultimate source of protection. Wait a minute, say that one more time. I don't know how you made that diversion when you came back and what you're talking about. The ultimate source of protection, we believe, is Allah. He provides the ultimate source of protection. So isn't it the same logic to suppose, to postulate, to submit, to say that if you break the contract that was initially in place, the mithaq, and that you agreed upon in the primordial state, if you sever that contract, there should be a consequence. And it's within the rights of the source of protection to remove that protection from you. That's why the question that's usually postulated in these discussions is, if God is so merciful, then why does hell exist? Why is he putting the people in the hellfire? What kind of merciful God is that? He's putting the people in the hellfire. What kind of justice is that? The hellfire is an ultimate manifestation of the removal of Allah's protection from humans. Say that one more time. The hellfire is an ultimate manifestation of the removal of Allah's protection from human beings. And since we agree on the premise that it's consequentially justifiable to say that protection should no longer be afforded to those who sever the contracts, then what more contract more problematic to sever than the one who's providing for you in all aspects and domains and spheres of life? The answer to that question is the people that don't understand the hellfire and the punishment therein are those same people that don't understand the severity of the contract that they have agreed to and that they were reminded of in this world. So you see, it all makes sense now. But someone may argue and say, but hold on, no problem. I understand this concept. I understand, yes, that if you sever the contract, there should be consequences. Yeah? If you sever the contract, there should be consequences. From this perspective, God is within his rights to give you those consequences. So what then about proportionality? For instance, if someone was a kafir or a disbeliever, someone who severed the contract, because what is a disbeliever? disbeliever is someone, kafir literally means kafara, from the farmer. He's a farmer. Because he's literally covering the truth. Like the seed, you coat it with soil, and the truth, you're covering it with falsehood. And that is the ultimate manifestation of the severing of the contract. But the question of proportionality will come into play, because they'll say, okay, if they were disbelievers for 3 years, or 5 years, or 10 years, or 20 years, then why should they be in the hellfire forever? And this is a lack of proportionality. Yes, this is a lack of proportionality. Well, we say to that, who told you that time should all be treated equally and sins should be connected to time inextricably? Let me give you an example. And this brother of mine called Abdullah Andalusi, we were discussing this, he was giving me these pointers. It was a really good example he gave. I like to give him credit for that. He said, for example, if someone takes out a knife and he stabs someone, goes straight for the jugular and kills the person in 3 seconds. Yes? If someone does that in 3 seconds, should they be punished for 3 seconds? On this logic, they should be. Why not? 3 seconds. You only were transgressing for 3 seconds. So go into prison for 3 seconds, or do this, or go to the hellfire for 3 seconds. No. Clearly, there's a problem with equating time here. So the idea is shirk, or the association of partners with Allah, is valued so epistemically high in the ranking of crimes, because it is the ultimate rupturing of the most important contract, that even doing it for 1 second, even believing in that and doing it for 1 second, it's conceivable for 1 second, 2 seconds, 5 seconds, and you die upon it, and those are your last 5 seconds, that you will be in eternal punishment in the hellfire. And that is logically, rationally justifiable on both worldviews. Because to understand Allah and Tawheed, we must understand shirk and how dark and horrible and evil and grotesque and disgusting this crime is. How dare someone redirect their veneration, their love, their awe, their hope, their fear from the one who's offering all sources of hope and all sources of protection from fear, who is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is the most problematic and egregious and the most vile of crimes any human being can do. Worse than theft, worse than murder, worse than rape. There's nothing worse than that. Why is murder wrong? Because it's an ultimate violation of someone's right to life. Why is rape wrong? Because it's an ultimate violation of a man or a woman's right to dignity and to decision-making in sexual intercourse. So why is shirk wrong? Because it's an ultimate redirection. It's an ultimate redirection of all of the attitudes, the beliefs, and the actions that should be positioned to the one who allows them to be positioned to anything in the first place to other than him. It's the worst kind of oppression. Shirk is the worst kind of oppression. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us some Interesting points. He says, وَمِنَ النَّاسِ مَن يَتَّخِذُ مِن دُونِ اللَّهِ أَنْدَادًا يُحِبُّونَهُمْ كَحُبِّ اللَّهِ وَالَّذِينَ آمَنُوا أَشَدُّ حُبًّا لِلَّهِ. He says there are some people who take andad, and nid is a false god, and they love them as much as the believers, as they ought to love Allah, and the believers are more loving of Allah. With this verse we know that if you position your love, your ultimate love, to other than the creator of love and the source of love, who is Al-Wud, who is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Al-Wadud, the one who's the source of all love, then what kind of egregious misappropriation is that? What kind of movement away from the truth is that? How can that be justified? Yes, your attention, you wake up now, this guy was asleep. I have a question. Why is it the case that if I pull out a knife and break down or cut down a tree, which is a living creature, yeah? A tree is a living creature. If I cut down a tree, or if I cut open a baby, a living baby, why is it that almost everyone, almost intrinsically, would say that doing the latter thing, i.e. cutting the child, is more problematic, more sinful and so on, than cutting down the tree? Where it's the same action. Think about it, it's actually the same action. I've got the knife, I'm cutting the thing, same action. The reason why is because we place more value on the life of humans than we do on the life of trees. Obviously, in the analogy we can't super extend it to Allah, because you can't transgress against Allah in a way that would harm Him. But the idea is you can transgress to Allah in a way that will harm yourself. And so if the presupposition is that the transgression or the aggregate net value of how bad something is depends upon the thing you're doing it to. Say that one more time. Okay. How bad something is depends upon what or who you're doing that thing to. Like in our example, cutting a child or cutting down a tree, they're not seen as the same, are they? So, what about if you have a maximally perfect, all-powerful, all-loving agency, whereby there is no value that can possibly, rationally, fathomably be more powerful than Him? What about in that situation? Transgression towards this entity must by logical necessity mean, it must by logical necessity mean that that transgression should be valued in the highest form possible. If not, then on materialism, all of these atoms will have the same epistemic value. Me cutting open a child, me opening cutting the tree, same thing, just rearrangement of atoms, doesn't matter. I can do whatever I want. But the truth is this, guys. The truth is, you'll never be able to value yourself, and we will never be able to value ourselves collectively until we realize how we have been given value. We will never be able to love ourselves until we realize how we have been given that love. Because the truth is, I was reading Eric Fromm, I think his name is Eric Fromm, and he was talking about loving oneself. we've talked about hellfire for a long time. So maybe I think we should end with love in heaven or something, because it is a bit sometimes an intense subject. But he was saying, Eric Fromm was saying, it's not from egocentricity. Yeah, it's not something which is selfish if you actually love yourself, because what you're doing is you're valuing your integrity as a human being. That was his argument. He's saying you're valuing your integrity, your person as a human being, and loving yourself is not an expression of ego. It's not. But if we extend this understanding to asking the important question of who created us, which we talked about probably in the last session, and I'm sure you had that conversation yesterday as well. Who created us? And we come to the conclusion that it was this all-powerful, all-knowing, Al-Qadir, Al-Alim, Al-Hakim, the wise one, the powerful one, and so on. And of course the loving one as well, yeah? When you come to that conclusion, then you love more the one who created you than yourself. And the reason why is because he was the sabab, the reason, the cause for your existence. So as we say, min babi awla, it's prioritized for you as a human being to love the thing or the one that created you more than yourself, because it caused you to be. And so, having love in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, going back to our example of the baby and the mother, is something not only immediately and intrinsically known, but should be rationally understood as well. If you love yourself, you should love Allah. And that's why Umar ibn Khattab, when he went to Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, and he was asked about who does he love the most, and he says, you know, I love you, i.e. the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, more than everyone except for myself. And then he said, you know, go back, because you have to love Allah and His Messenger more than everyone else. And he went back, introspected, came back and changed his position. And that spiritual engagement with oneself about how we love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala should be something we're consistent with. We should reason to ourselves on a daily basis that Allah is the ultimate source of all the love in the world, and therefore we should be most loving to Him. And I'll end with this, because we want to open up the questions and answers. What I will say is that look what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has done for us. Despite the fact that we proverbially, signed the agreement, if you like, the cosmic agreement, the spiritual, metaphysical, cosmic agreement with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that, alastu bi rabbikum, qalu bala shahidna. We said, yes, we do take you as your master. Despite the fact that we signed that cosmic agreement, Allah yet gave us the chance through messengers and prophets to realize His existence once again. And subhanAllah, Surah Nur and Ayat Nur in particular, it gives us a beautiful analogy of how this all works out, and that requires another lecture altogether. But there's one thing in particular which I wanted to stress, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says that this process is nurun ala nur. That we're born, almost you could say, you could argue, with this innate fitrah, this predisposition, this primordial state to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, just like a baby loves his mother, or even more than that, way more than that. We're born with that love, we're born with that connection, we're born with that agreement. Yet, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala provides for us messengers and prophets that help reaffirm that agreement, remind us of the agreement, give us evidences for the agreement. And and so on and so forth. And so, just like, well, someone will say, maybe a materialist skeptic, I don't remember the agreement, you know. That's the point. You might not remember the agreement because of the process of socialization. They say, well, this is not an agreement I willfully got myself into. You didn't willfully get yourself into this agreement with your mother. You didn't choose to be your mother's son, for instance, or daughter. But by virtue of relationship, the agreement existed. And by virtue of existence, that relationship existed. And in the same way, by virtue of us being ibad Allah, the slaves of Allah, the creation of Allah, the agreement exists, and we must remind ourselves of it. We must love Allah, bring ourselves to fear no fear more than His fear, and have no love more than His love, and have no more hope than in the hope He puts in us. Jazakumullahu khairan, and we're going to open it up, inshallah, for questions and answers.
And that was called the enthusiastic speaker. So, with that being said, Jazakumullahu khairan for attending, and with that being said as well, we'll be starting off the very Q&A session. So, depending on the category of your very question, we'll be addressing it accordingly in the following context. So, I'd love to call upon Mr. and Sheikh Mohammed Usman, who is the Chief Executive Officer of SALAM, Salam. A brief introduction to Sheikh Mohammed Usman is, he is an Islamic theologian, lecturer, and teacher of Islamic studies who has been taught in many international contexts in the West and the Middle East. He graduated from Medina University, Islamic University in KSA, Saudi Arabia, with a bachelor's in Hadith and Islamic Sciences. The Sheikh has numerous ijazat in various disciplines, such as Hanbali, jurisprudence, and many books of Hadith. His prominent list of teachers include Sheikh Dr. Abdullah Al-Ghunayman, Sheikh Abdul Muhsin Al-Abbad, Sheikh Dr. Khalid Afifi, and many others. He is currently pursuing a master's in Usul al-Fiqh, Principles of Jurisprudence from the International Islamic University of Malaysia. He has led and directed multiple successful Islamic organizations in the UK in multiple disciplines. So, as most of you here have already been very much aware of what's written on the board and what's written on the bottom right corner of the slide, this is the questionnaire. So if you have any question, there will not be any papers passed down. So if you have any question, please do submit it right away to the portal and we'll be saying it out loud. We'll be opening the floor for questions from the audience. However, the very simple rule stays where you get a question and you have a simple follow-up. And if you're very much interested in getting more entertained speakers, you can later on get to meet them out of the venue hall. So with that being said, we'll first start off with questions from the audience. Are there any questions from the ladies or from the gentlemen section? Are there any questions?
Yes. The mic on the table and picked it up. Do we use it?
Okay, so seeing that
there's no mic.
None. There are a couple of interesting questions here on the form, and one of which says,
is it possible to do it now?
There are many possibilities of reality. How do you believe in one ultimate reality?
And the other one, we need to do it.
So the answer to the question is that if you're asking from a philosophical perspective about reality, I don't want to go into a long philosophical lecture. It might bore you guys. It's interesting for me, but might not be interesting for you. So in philosophy, there are three schools of thought. There is materialism, dualism, and idealism. And materialistic conceptions of the real world are that which is physical and empirically proven through the five senses. Dualism is the mind and body separation. And then idealism is that everything which is thought ontologically is that which is real. It's like a matrix world, basically. That makes you wake up. So the short answer is, when I present arguments for God's existence, I realize that there are those three schools of thought, for example, and what I try and do is I cater for all of them. So I put forward an argument that can be made ontologically, which means just solely in the mind, and at the same time it can be made cosmologically as well. So now an atheist can't say, but I'm not a materialist, I'm an idealist. So okay, well I've got the argument for you in an idealist format. If he says, no, I'm a materialist, no problem. The same argument applies cosmologically. If you're a dualist, no problem. Once again, you can combine between the two things. And so, on all conceptions of the reality of the universe, one can make an argument for the existence of God. And I think probably the best one, which will tick all three philosophical boxes, is the contingency argument, which postulates that everything which is dependent.
The very underpinning of Iman is to believe in Allah Jalla wa Ala, and to believe in that which He has brought forth and that which He has sent by way of messengers, by way of revelation. And by virtue of that, we accept and we believe everything that is indicated in the Kitab and the Sunnah. And from that is Yawm al-Qiyamah. From that is Yawm al-Ma'ad, the final recompense, the day of judgment, the day of reckoning, the day of standing. And likewise, this applies to any other arkan al-Iman, any other pillar of faith. We believe in it. We believe in it with absolute certainty, as Imam Hijab says, وَأَيْقُنُوا بِذَلِكَ كُلِّهِ. And they have complete certainty in everything that is authentic, everything that has come down from Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, by way of the Messenger sallallahu alayhi wa sallam.
Are there any questions from the floor? That's interesting.
What's going on? I know there's some questions. Come on.
However,
if you want to write it down on a piece of paper, guys, if you want to write it down on a piece of paper and then bring it to the front, that's all right.
That's very interesting because this does not stop. I have a lot of questions here.
Oh, okay.
So
we do want to get a bit of engagement, otherwise we're going to ask you questions. Yeah? So we'll give you one more question and otherwise we're going to start asking you questions. And I'll start with this guy that wanted to wrestle me in the masjid there. Yeah. And I've got a question. How did you feel being in that position?
Yeah. We'll speak about wrestling later. Discover Islam, my brothers and sisters, and the question says, prove that the Quran has never been altered.
Yeah, okay. Right, okay, so I'll do something, you can do something, inshallah. Well, here's the thing. That is actually a bit of a trick question, actually. If you think about it on the face of the primary facing value. Are there variations of the Quran which are sanctioned by the Prophet? Yeah? Are there alterations which are sanctioned by the Prophet? Therefore, from an Islamic perspective, from an Islamic perspective, they're acceptable and legitimate. Yeah, there are. So, for example, the Qira'ah of Malik and Malik, yeah? These are variations. Now, which are sanctioned by the Prophet. Malik means owner of the Day of Judgment, Malik means the king of the Day of Judgment. The question is, has there been any omission or insertion into the Quran, which is not sanctioned by the Prophet? That's the true question. Yeah? Has there been any omission and insertion into the Quran which is non-sanctioned, illegitimate, non-religious? And the answer is easily provable that it's not the case. And we prove this through tawatur, the fact that you have different levels of Sahaba, all of which recited the same material that was received to them by the Prophet Muhammad, the same Quran, and that this existed at every level. We also have, as we know in Turkey, and in Sana'a, in Yemen, and other places, we have the physical mushaf. That physical mushaf has actually been carbon dated to 651 AD. It's respectable carbon dated, which means it goes back from that method to the time of Uthman. From a historical perspective, it's definitely acceptable. You have other materials which reference the Quran, all of which reference it in the ways which have been legitimized by the Prophet Muhammad. And therefore, there is an abundance of evidence to the preservation of the Quran as we understand the term Quran, including of the variants which are sanctioned and legitimized by the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So the main counter-argument someone has to this is the putting forward of qira'at differences. But the weakness of that counter-argument doesn't consider the fact that they're legitimized by the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That's the main argument. Apart from that though, it's certainly preserved. It's certainly, and there's no controversy now. I mean, you're not going to find Muslims are fighting about everything, right? They're fighting about, you know, how many tarawih prayers to do, politics. They're fighting each other, but they don't fight about, you know, what the Quran is. That's not something you'll find a Sufi or a Salafi or a Ikhwani or a Deobandi or a Brelfi fighting each other in the streets about. All of them have the same Quran, and that is something which the Christians cannot boast, for example. They cannot say that they have.
Destiny, the contradiction of having a free will. How do we have a free will if everything is written for us since birth? And when the answer is, can't you do anything you want, it doesn't prove this wrong. Doesn't it prove this wrong? It just confirms the contradiction.
Yeah. Okay. The reality, brothers and sisters, that the issue of qadr, the issue of predestination, is something that we can't grasp fully of it. We know that there is something that exists called qadr, predestination, and we accept this and we believe in this. And were it not for the fact that it has been mentioned, then it's very difficult logically to deduce this. Now, I want to share something that I think is very powerful and very pertinent. And to be honest, most of the questions I get, I'm sure Mohammed and many brothers get, it's about determinism, it's about, you know, predestination, free will, whether or not it's actually exists or not. How do we cope with this? Okay? I want to share something that's, I think, very powerful. And that is, no matter what position you give, and of course we give the position of the Sunnah, which is that every person has been created with a type of mashia, a type of free will. This free will is not absolute and unrestricted. In fact, it's muqayyad, or it's restricted by the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is belief. And this is the most kind of coherent and well understood belief and easily explainable belief that you could find out of all of the beliefs that have been mentioned by the different firaq and different sects. Now what I want to share is what, and I quote again from Imam Tahawi, and you hear me quoting a lot from Imam Tahawi always. Imam Tahawi, Abu Ja'far Tahawi passed away in year 321 after the hijrah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It's perhaps one of the earliest complete creedal texts that we have in our heritage, in our Islamic heritage. And it's something that literally has been agreed upon and accepted upon by whether you are Ash'ari, whether you are Maturidi, whether you are quote unquote Salafi, Hanbali, Athari, whatever you want to call it. It's agreed by everyone. And that is Imam Tahawi says, وَالْقَدَرْ سِرُّ اللَّهِ تَعَالَى فِي خَلْقِهِ. He says at the beginning that qadr is a secret from Allah in His creation. لَمْ يَطَّلِعْ عَلَى ذَلِكَ مَلَكٌ مُقَرَّبٌ وَلَا نَبِيٌّ مُرْسَلٌ. A prophet, nor a close or sent messenger or angel have been given full knowledge of that. وَتَعَمُّقْ فِي ذَلِكَ ذَرِيعَةُ الْخِذْلَانِ. And to think about it constantly and to ask questions about it constantly is a means of transgression. وَسُلَّمُ الْحِرْمَانِ. It's a stairway to complete prohibition. وَدَرَجَةُ الطُّغْيَانِ. It's a degree of tyranny. And he says, whomsoever thinks about this constantly, asking himself questions about it, fikran wa waswasa, thinking about it, asking about it, pondering about it, he will find himself lost. And he will find himself possibly even leaving the fold of Islam. And he says, continuing this, لأن الرب, because the Lord, Allah Jalla wa Ala, لا يسأل عما يفعل. He is not to be asked about what He does. Rather, they are asked, the creation are asked about what they do. لا يسأل عما يفعل وهم يسألون. Allah Jalla wa Ala says that they are not asked about what they do. Rather, Allah is not asked about what He does. Rather, the creation asks what they do. The reality, brothers, is that this qadr, this issue of qadr, is a part of the knowledge which we don't have complete knowledge of. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in His infinite wisdom hasn't given us full knowledge of this. وَمَا أُوتِيتُم مِّنَ الْعِلْمِ إِلَّا قَلِيلًا. You have not been granted of knowledge except a small amount. And we have to be humble and we have to accept it. But you know what? Allahu A'lam. Allah is best at the full description of us. Just like we know we believe in the soul, right? We believe that there's an existence called the ruh, right or wrong? Yes, now. Is there anyone here that can explain it fully? The haqiqah, the reality of it? No. We believe in this. Why? Because we have been informed of this. Allah Jalla wa Ala was always right.
You say that.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
You want to say something?
Yeah, I just want to add something to it. Yeah. What I was going to say was that we always have to look at the premise of the interrogator. So the premise of the interrogator here is that we should look at it that determinism and free will in a vacuum are contradictory, yeah? But we're not looking at it in a vacuum. The question is, our premise is as follows: if something is not fundamentally against the sifat al-dhatiyya of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the intrinsic, essential attributes of Allah, then Allah can make it possible. So for example, Allah is capable of making it happen. So in other words, if someone says Allah is 3 in 1 and 1 in 3, this is problematic because it goes against the fact that He's one God. So it's a contradiction to His essential attribute of oneness. If one took the Jabari position, which is an old school position, which is that Allah has all the power and that human beings have no free will, this will be problematic because it removes agency from humans, and you could argue it's unjust because Allah create human beings that He put into the fire without them having any free will in that matter at all. However, if you went for the Qadri position, which was the fact that human beings are the ones who have full agency and Allah has no power to influence that decision of the human being, then that would contradict the omnipotence of God, the qudra of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the will, the power of Allah. So the two alternative, possible, logical opinions would contradict the sifat al-dhatiyya of Allah. That's why it's actually necessary from a theological perspective that Allah has created human beings, given them free will, and at the same time maintained control of, number one, the knowledge of that, number two, the mashia of that, He had will of that at all times, and number three, the khalq of that, the amal of that, the action of that, and the kitabah as well, actually, the writing of that in the Lawh al-Mahfuz. So those four things are always going to be in place. So having said that, the question should be as follows: is it against Allah's attributes for there to be a coexistence of free will with godly determinism? Think about that question. That's an important question. Is it against Allah's essential attributes for there to be a coexistence of free will, humanly free will, and godly determinism? The answer is it's not against the attributes, it's not contrary to any of His attributes, therefore it's conceivable. It might not be inconceivable, it might be inconceivable to us, because all we can imagine from our experience is that this free will means you're in control and determinism means you're not. You can't have control and no control at the same time, therefore it's a contradiction. However, that's not considering the will of Allah, the ability of Allah. That's not considering that. So long as it doesn't contradict His will, it's possible from a theological perspective.
I believe there's a question from the sister side.
There's one there.
We'll take you next.
Jazakallah khair for the talk. So I'm asking on behalf of a friend of mine that comes from a Christian faith. So you mentioned in your talk just now that God is all-knowing and He can do whatever He wills, correct? So if God can do anything He wants because He's God, if God wants to have a full personal relationship within Himself, who are we in our limited knowledge and logic dare to object Him? So why is the concept of Trinity wrong?
Well, because it's against the essential attribute of being one. You can't say He's 1 and 3 at the same time. It's different. You see, the idea is, if He's 1, He cannot be 3. But that's a very straightforward thing to say. He can either only be 1 or be 3. You can have one all-powerful agent, or you can have 3 non-powerful agents, or non-all-powerful agents. You can't have 3 all-powerful agents. So it goes back to the discussion we had about not only the logical consistency, but the logical consistency taking into consideration the essential attributes of God, which are discovered through rational discussion and as well as the textual evidences. Does that make sense?
So we have another question. Do you have a follow-up?
I'm not the one asking the question, but I'll get back to the person.
Okay, so can I please have the mic passed down to the sister in front?
If you, since we say that God is all-knowing, wouldn't you argue that since Allah is all-knowing, He knows every single possibility that's ever could happen and ever would have happened, and thus we are given free will to exercise it, but God will know which path we take regardless of which one we choose to do?
That's right.
Okay, thank you.
So that's it. Does Allah know what we're going to do? Like, if we're going, yeah, He knows we're going to go to heaven.
You know, there's a famous kind of line that's always in books of theology, which is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alima ma kan, Allah knows what was, وما هو كائن, what is, وما سيكون, what will be, وما لم يكن لو كان كيف يكون, even what was going to be if it was not going to be. I mean, if there was not this concept of ilm and this complete, absolute, perfect understanding of knowledge that's attributed to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then that would be a defect in Allah. It would be a defect in Allah, and it will contradict the fact that He's Alim. He's all-knowing, and He's maximally perfect in this knowledge. It will completely contradict it, and that will again go back to our understanding of what is Allah. What is Allah?
Yes.
What is Al-Ilah? I mean, is there that a deity that we can refer to as a maximally perfect being? So come back to that.
All right. So do we have any questions from the brothers' side?
Brothers, come on, brothers. Bismillah. This is box 2, verse 0.
Brother, yeah, I think he wants to say, ask a question. Yes.
Yes, please. I would kindly ask you to stand up and raise your voice a little bit.
Okay.
Now you're making it hard for the other brothers. Stand up as well and raise their voice.
Actually, I'm not a student. I'm from the outsider, so because I think very welcome to Brother Mohammed Hijab. I think you paste on the Facebook, big fan of you, and together with Brother Hijab. So really appreciate all the things whatsoever. So just now you say that you met Zakir Naik, right? So I will be watching you guys' video, which is a good one. That both of you are discussing about how is it that that this Al-Quran and also the scientific, when you try to relate this or this kind of thing. So I think just now did you discuss with him? So maybe you can give.
We're laughing because we actually film anything with him.
Yeah, so just a little bit, maybe a brief one about how is it that currently maybe there is a certain people that connects this scientific finding, which is we know that it can be changeable or this kind of thing, which is Quran is ultimately, that's the word of God in terms of timeless. Okay, that's really my question.
Like, actually, it's interesting that you asked that because me and Hijab, Mohammed Hijab, we actually filmed a 4-part series on scientific miracles in reference to Zakir Naik. This was about 2 years ago. You can find it on this channel. We went through most of the scientific miracles, quote unquote, that has been kind of popularized by Zakir Naik. And we discussed that. And to be honest, if you don't want to watch all of them, watch the first episode, brothers and sisters, inshallah. Because we discussed the kind of first principles, or the kind of usul, if you want to call it that, and the principles that you have to have and utilize and understand in order to make sense of this claim of scientific miracles. And one thing Zakir Naik actually says, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala preserve him, and protect him. Say Ameen, brothers and sisters. Ameen. It is that he says, the Quran is a book of science, not a book of science. This is very important to understand this. And our understanding of scientific miracles in the Quran is a very straightforward one. And that is exactly what Imam Abu Ishaq al-Shatibi rahimahullah ta'ala mentions in I'tisam al-Fiqh, one of his most seminal works, is that we may see a kind of resemblance to what's being popularized in modern day science. He's talking about his time, 7th century, 8th century Andalusia, okay? But we cannot say categorically that this is what Allah meant in the Quran. Very simple. We cannot say Allah meant this in the Quran. Why? Because if there is no textual inference, if there's no nas, there's no clear text wa ta'ala himself in the Quran or from the Messenger sallallahu alayhi wa sallam saying that this is a scientific miracle, this is the Big Bang, for example. Okay? Then we cannot say that. We cannot impose our understanding of the Quran. In fact, to do that would be sanctimonious, subhanAllah, it would be scandalous to do that and be completely wrong. So what we can say is that if linguistically, the ayah, the text, even the hadith, allows us to understand a certain ayah in reference to any particular model of science that's being postulated today, or whatever, any time, then we can say it's a possibility. That's the most we can say. Allah Jalla wa Ala knows best. We cannot say this is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala meant. And as you know, brothers and sisters, philosophy of science, something that I'm sure most of you have read into it, but the models of science change. There's also a paradigm shift happening in science. Something that is popular today may not be popular in 20 years' time or 30 years' time. Does that mean now, subhanAllah, if you don't believe, if the Big Bang is now, in 20 years' time, is looked down upon as being something completely incorrect, it's a wrong hypothesis, does that mean now you've lost your iman? The reality is that one of the top 10 reasons of ridda and apostasy within Muslims is when there is a so-called scientific miracle that is debunked by the scientific community. They then lose faith in the Quran. And they lose faith straight away. They're like, wait, if this scientific miracle, the scientists are saying this, how can this be? How can this be? There must be that the Quran is wrong. And the reality is there is no such thing as absolute scientific truth in the first place. There are hypotheses, there are, these kind of theories. So we can't impose that on the Quran, but we can say it's possible. And to be honest, out of all of the, subhanAllah, major world religions, the one most closely inclined or in accordance or in agreement with modern day science is Islam. Hands down, it's Islam, subhanAllah. And again, this is proof also of the sidq, of the truthfulness of the Messenger sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Because how could it be if you fabricate the Quran? If you fabricate, how could it be that he got what is most in accordance to modern day science at any particular given time, subhanAllah? So Allah Jalla wa Ala knows best.
You say that we are born with a contract with God. But how do we know whether if it's Allah or some other God?
Well, as the scholars say, you can call it, let's say for the sake of argument, even if you say it's not Allah, don't call him Allah, but you're referring to him. So you can, and this is one of the semantic games that a lot of atheists fall into. You say, okay, well, I don't believe in you, Allah. I say, well, what do you believe in him? And then you go through the arguments with them, and they end up believing in an all-powerful agency, which is eternal and so on. So we refer to that agency as Allah. So if you don't want to call it Allah, but it has all the attributes of it, then it's just your refusal to use a term that is commonly used to refer to the thing that you actually do believe. So sometimes words can obscure what the meanings are, and so someone doesn't want to believe in the word Allah, just for the sake of argument, use another name. It doesn't mean that the concepts are wrong.
As God is all powerful. Oh, please.
So the friend replied to me, and she couldn't anyway. So if God is a social God, and if He's only one in Himself, it's a bit of a long one, so you might want to listen carefully. If God is a social God and if He's only one in Himself, essentially He needs humans to be social with. A God that needs something other than Himself is not God. Islam therefore teaches an insufficient, needy God. A triune God shows that He is God, all-sufficient and in Himself, and furthers His ability and grace to love us. How? If God is one and social, then He needs us. It is impossible for God to need anything. If God is two and social, then He won't relate with anyone because He has a close, exclusive relationship in Himself. Hence, God is triune, leaving space around the table for imperfect beings like us, saved by His grace.
I think the person is, whoever, no disrespect to the person who's asking the question. I know it's not you, obviously, but they don't really know how to use logical arguments properly, because let's say, for example, we agree with the premise that God is a social being, which, by the way, we don't agree with right now in that wording, yeah? Let's say, for the sake of argument, why does it have to be triune? Why not 5 gods, or 5 in 1, or 7 in 1, or 8 in 1? If it has to be social, it's a matter of, they have to speak to someone, right? So why does it have to be 3 people? Why is that the magic number? Why not 8 people, or not 11? Because they know that it's going to end up being Christianity, it's going to end up being Hinduism. so if that's the argument, it doesn't necessitate triunity at all, or Trinity in any way. It just necessitates, if that's the argument, polytheism, or kind of conglomeration of gods, the like of which we saw in the Greek mythological times, where you had Zeus and his son, and they're having a good time, and they're talking to each other and all this kind of thing. So that doesn't mean anything. But the Quran actually responds to this by saying, لو أردنا أن نتخذ لهوا لاتخذناه من لدنا إن كنا فاعلين. It says, if we wanted to really take a pastime, in other words, entertainment, we would have taken it from among ourselves. In other words, if we were really going to do something, right? If we were really active in that respect. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says after that to Him belongs وَلَهُ مَنْ فِي السَّمَاوَاتِ وَمَنْ فِي الْأَرْضِ وَمَنْ عِنْدَهُ لَا يَسْتَكْبِرُونَ عَنْ عِبَادَتِهِ وَلَا يَسْتَحْسِرُونَ. That to Him belongs everything in the heavens and the earth. So He doesn't, in other words, this is almost like a reply. Why does He need? Why are you assuming that Allah has this social, He needs to speak to someone or something like that, or have entertainment or enjoyment, or that's, in fact, funnily enough, that's the needy premise. Why does it need to be social? As it would a cup of tea, this and that, let's have a God at tea time joke, this and that play. No, God is far above and beyond those conceptions. And finally, I would say, usually the argument that people like William Lane Craig put forward, which is a little bit more sophisticated, but also based on false premises, is the idea that they say, okay, well, if God is loving, which we've been talking about today, then He'll need someone to love. Yeah? And so they say, okay, well, that's why the conception of Trinity is better than the conception of unity, because it shows that there has been a perpetual state of love giving and love receiving. You see, that's a stronger argument, but it's still problematic, because the assumption is that Allah needs to always exhibit the attribute that He possesses. And if that is the case, then why doesn't He exhibit, for example, His propensity to give punishment? Because if Allah is the just one, and is the one who can inflict punishment, then why doesn't He always perpetually exhibit that eternally into the past? So in other words, if you want to use it for love, and if you want to use it for sociability, then you should also use it for punishment. So who is punishing who? Is Jesus punishing the Father, or is the Father punishing the Holy Spirit? That's the question I would ask your friend. Thank you.
What if someone says, I didn't agree to the contract, I didn't choose to be born? How can the contract be fair if it's one-sided?
We don't agree to the contracts a lot of the time, and that doesn't mean that they're not correct. For example, has anyone agreed here? Has anyone been asked a question? You know, do you want to follow the Malaysian law or not? No, you're forced by virtue of existence in this land that you have a social contract with the Malaysian government, and if you go against the law, there are consequences. And so the assumption is contracts require consent. Contracts do not require consent, not on liberalism, not on social contract theory, and certainly not in universal law theory. Contracts exist by virtue of relationship sometimes. I'm born, I'm the child of my mother. I owe my mother a deeper societal, sociological, and familial duty than I owe any other woman. I didn't choose to be her son, and she did. Well, she might have chosen to be my brother, that's different. But it's definitely one-sided. I didn't choose that. You see? But it's a contract which most societies accept. Why is it the case? For example, let me give you an example, right? If you go and you have a child, yes? If you have a child, what of the woman, if you go to the hospital and your child is born, have you ever thought about what is it? What is causing? Why is it the case that you can take that child home now, and the government says, "Give me the child. It's my child." For example, the reason why is because there's a biological presupposition that all children that have been conceived of women almost belong to those women. They are in contract with those women. And there's a biological presupposition which is upheld by every society I know of. Every single, except for the Pharaoh of Egypt one where they used to burn the boys and all that kind of stuff in the ancient times. But it's upheld, and the reason why is because it's almost intuitive knowledge, right? So the presupposition is that contracts should always be two-sided. No, they can be one-sided, and they're still legitimate and valid in some cases.
We'll open the floor to questions after this question. It says, prove that God is not created.
We need a couple of questions for Sheikh. You're giving me prove that God is not created. So usually, if we're going with the cosmological arguments, then we would say there's an infinite regress. Who created who? If there's an infinite line of creation, then there'd be an infinite regress of creation. Just like if there's an infinite line of causation, there'd be an infinite regress of causation. That is an argument that can be made. However, one can even make a better argument. Because someone could say, well, I don't care, I believe in infinite regress, as we said before in the seminar that we were talking about. Here's the point. Once you define God, you rule out the possibility of him having anything that affects him. So in other words, nothing can supervene on the essence of God. Once one realizes through discussion that God is the eternal, one, independent, then by virtue of that discussion, you realize that nothing can affect God, basically. So by extension, even if you want to believe in an infinite regress, you have a problem of what preponderance can supervene on the inherent attributes of God. So, is that like a lot of big words or something like that? Okay, so in other words, you can't have, by virtue of the fact that God is independent, eternal, one, and that he pre-exists all of creation, nothing can affect him. That goes without saying. Let alone create him.
Any questions from the floor? Yes, please.
Jazakumullah khair. Thank you so much for the wonderful talk. The question I have is, as Muslims and the views that we have about God and the proposition you have tonight, the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, I know this is the topic for tomorrow's night, but what are the struggles that he went through explaining to the pagan believers and the non-believers at his time the concept of God and the struggles they went through affirming that there is one true God and how that is practiced or embodied in everyday life?
Allah Akbar. What a question, mashallah. I think this question deserves a couple of lectures in and of itself, the answer to this, to be honest with you. But I mean, just very simply, when you look at Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, his seerah, and you look at his life, and you look at how he embodied this call that he was sent with, the call that all of the Anbiya, all of the prophets were sent with, which was the call of Tawheed, you could see that immediately this affected him in a number of ways. Firstly, it affected him personally. Because by him calling to Allah and Allah alone for worship, it affected the status quo, which was the prevailing norm in Qurayshi society, which was to worship more than one God. Over 360 idols they had. And this was mainly done by mentioning some of the ulama. Not only it was not only done for theological purposes, but a lot of it was for economic reasons as well. Building ties with neighboring tribes, having dominance and control over the Kaaba, which was the main trading route as well at the time. So by Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam being sent with this call, as he gathered the Quraysh together, and he said, if I was to tell you that there was an army behind me, akuntum musaddiqeen, would you believe me? And they all said, of course we'll believe you. You have never lied before. Then he said, I have been sent as a forewarner, warning you of a painful punishment. And then Abu Lahab said, أجمعتنا لهذا? يعني, have you gathered us just to tell us this? تبا. You know, woe be to you, why have you wasted our time for this? And then as the days went on, and then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala instructed the Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam to then be open with the calling after it was done in secretly. فَاصْدَعْ بِمَا تُؤْمَرْ وَأَعْرِضْ عَنِ الْمُشْرِكِينَ. An ayah that was very heavy upon Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. It was very weighty upon him, which was to now preach openly, call them all to Tawheed. And Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, this ayah was very, very, very weighty upon him. Because now it meant, rather than do something in secret, he had to go out into the public now and face persecution, public persecution. We know what happened when he was at the Kaaba and he was in sujood, and they brought the entrails of a camel and they threw it upon him in front of everyone, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. And then Fatima radiallahu ta'ala anha came and started taking off her father's back, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. We know what happened to Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam when he went to Tabuk and he started calling the people after he was forsaken by Quraysh, after the boycott happened and they were not beneath him. And the people of Tabuk gathered their children to throw stones at him, in Ta'if afwan, and to ridicule him. And then eventually he was covered in blood. And even when the angel of the Jibal of the mountains came to him and asked him, if you want, I will collapse these mountains upon him. And he said, of course not. You know, it could be from their progeny, those that believe in them. So Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam went through personal struggles with this. He went through struggles that, wallahi, words cannot describe. In order to call him Islam, he was called a sahir, a magician. He was called a kadhab, a liar. He was called a majnoon. He was called someone who was insane, who lost their mind. But yet he prevailed, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. And Allah Jalla wa Ala willed it that he will be successful. إِنَّا لَنَنْصُرُ رُسُلَنَا وَالَّذِينَ آمَنُوا. Indeed, we'll give victory to our messengers and to those who believe. And this, some of the ulama actually mentioned that this is one of the clearest signs that the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam was truthful. Because Allah granted him victory in his life and subhanallah after his passing sallallahu alayhi wa sallam in such a way that was never granted to anyone. The spirit of Islam is unparalleled in history. And so, yeah, this is, I mean, you know, the topic is definitely a great topic and requires a lot of discussion and kind of to examine it. But this is just a brief summary of it. Allah Ta'ala.
If God knows all possibilities and He knew that He would make a creation that would disappear, then why isn't it unjust to make creation of some who are doomed to hell?
So this, once again, the most logical form of this argument was put forward by a Hellenistic philosopher called Epicurus. And Epicurus, he put the argument in a little bit of a different way, but it's the same kind of argument. He said that if God created human beings, and he was talking about the problem of evil, he said that if you create evil in the world, his non-intervention in evil would be either against omnipotence or against his mercy. That's how he said it. But this logical form potentially could be used now to rehash this discussion or rehash this question. The question is it possible that God can maintain, or we can maintain a perfect understanding of God as a merciful God in the fact that, in the knowledge that He also puts people in the hellfire? So the answer to that question is as follows. As we said before, the hellfire is an ultimate manifestation of God's justice. And it's also an ultimate manifestation of His removal of His mercy. And so, if someone is asking, how can a merciful God put people in the hellfire? Then the answer is, in that instance, He's not utilizing His mercy per se. Or the main attribute being emphasized here is not mercy, is in fact justice. It's the removal of mercy, in fact. So we would agree with the questioner's sentiment that it's not the embodiment of mercy to put someone in the hellfire. That's why the Christian conception of God is an all-loving God that loves everyone is a flawed one. It's problematic. He said God loves you. But if God loves everyone, then why does he put some people in the hellfire? That's the question. We as Muslims, we don't say God loves everyone. We believe in conditional love. So if you do this, إن كنتم تحبون الله فاتبعوني يحببكم الله. If you love Allah, then follow me, i.e. the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and Allah will love you back. So it's conditional. Whereas with Christianity, it's supposedly unconditional. In which case, there will be a contradiction, because the question is, how can you have an all God that puts people in the hellfire? For us, we don't have such contradiction, because we have a God capable of removing his mercy from selected individuals who do not fit the criteria. And so the fallacy in the question, it goes back to the fact that a reductionist conception of God as consisting of only two attributes, namely omnipotence and mercy. Well, we know that Allah has more than that. He is not just omnipotent, i.e. powerful and merciful, but he's also just and wise, meaning he knows when to punish. He knows when it's appropriate to punish. So to answer the question, the only logical argument that can be made of this action of putting people in the hellfire, knowing that he'll go to the hellfire, creating them and putting them in the hellfire, is a conception of God as solely being a merciful and omnipotent God, which doesn't consider other attributes of justice and wisdom, for example. And Allah knows best.
How do you know Muhammad was not lying?
It's a good question. So, basically, I would say the best evidence for that is the Quran. Okay, because the Quran, as we went through in the seminar, is composed of things which are extra human, in the sense that they cannot be composed by human beings. And we talked about the linguistic and the structural and the prophetic and the historical accuracy of the Quran. And the linguistic and all those things, right? So that is probably the best argument one can make. When someone sees the veracity of those evidence items being put forward, then one is convinced through the evidence items, in addition to his khuluq and his fada'il and his virtues and so on. And I'm going to pass it on to the Sheikh. No. Sometimes I forget because, yes.
I mean, look, he covered on something, and I think he sometimes covered on as well, which is that, when you look at Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, and you look at his life, and this is something mentioned by Ghazali, mentioned by Ibn Abi al Hanafi for the 8th century, Shaykh Islam Tamiya, many of the kind of, one of the great theologians of Islam, they would say that Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, just by virtue of looking at his life and how he lived, he can never be a liar. Because we only have three options here. We only have three options. Either Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam was deluded, or he was lying, or he was truthful. And if he was lying, then this lie would be exposed. It would be exposed in one of the thousands, hundreds of thousands of prophetic hadith or ayat, claims made in the Quran, both in the Quran and the Sunnah. It would have to be exposed one way or another. Or certain facets of his life will have to be exposed and deemed unworthy in attribute to a prophet sent from God sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. But this is not the case. SubhanAllah, this is not the case any way, shape or form. And to actually tell today, I was actually reading something by a great alim from Islam called Jamaluddin Qasim. Jamaluddin Qasim.
Together, guys.
Yeah, Jamaluddin Qasim was a great muhaddith. He passed away about a century ago, maybe 2 centuries. And he has such a beautiful passage where he talks about the kind of what he mentioned, the structural coherence of the Quran and the linguistic miracle, the nature of the Quran, and how this could be from no man whatsoever. And he mentioned the story that Amr ibn al-As once went to Musaylimah al-Kadhab, the imposter, And he said, just now, this is Amr ibn As radiallahu anhu speaking, he said, just now, the surah was revealed to the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. A surah so simple but yet so powerful. You know what the surah was? Wal asr. By the token of time. Indeed, man is in loss, except for those who believe and those who do good deeds, and those who assist one another and those who assist one another in the in patience. And so Musaylima al-Kadhdhab, of course, knowing of the challenge of the Quran, he sat there for a minute. And then he was like, you know what? That's just been revealed to me as well. Yeah, something's been revealed to me as well. Wait, yeah, let me tell you. He started reading. Yeah, wabar. Wabar is like a little furry animal, like a rabbit. It's like, yeah, wabar. You know? Innama anta udhunan wa sadr. He's like, indeed, you're only composed of 2 ears and a chest. And the rest of you is like very close. And so Amr al-As is like, I know that you're lying, man. There's no way this will come from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the Quran and the life of the Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam are both the surahs, are both the, subhanallah, and the linguistic miracles of the Quran, the historical miracles of the Quran, the prophecies mentioned in the Quran, and the Sunnah. All of these combined, brothers, subhanallah, it is no way, shape, or form, it's impossible for it to have come from anyone other than a truthful messenger sent by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the creators of the heavens and the earth, and Allah Jalla wa Ala knows best.
So just a very quick disclaimer that the person who had asked the question regarding the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, will certainly be entertained furthermore tomorrow in tomorrow's lecture. So with that being said, I believe we have a question from the women's side. Yes, please. Can we have the mic passed down to her, please?
I'm okay with that without mic.
All right, then I'll have to ask you to raise your voice a little bit.
Okay. So I was listening to the sort of like hellfire and what comes in the afterlife and they do the things that are bad. I get nervous with my
Yes,
I can't do that. So I don't know if you know. Obviously, this is probably close to you before about the Stephen Fry episode with Brian about religious views, and he sort of said, say if you were at the pearly white gates and you had a question for God, and he basically said that why are children born with bone marrow cancer? I don't know if you probably have like an idea of what you're going to say or this question I'm asking, but I was just wondering like why are children subjected to a painful life on earth where it's not? Maybe it's in God's will, but yeah, I'm getting too nervous to carry on. Sort of what
Yeah. I watched that video online actually. So just kind of repeat what she said so everyone can hear. There's a guy, he's a famous atheist kind of commentator. I don't know what he's famous for, to be honest. What's he famous for? Comedian.
Yeah, it's quite a lot.
Yeah, I don't know what he's famous for. Why? He's definitely famous for something in the UK.
Yeah.
Which I'm gathering. I'm happy that I found someone from the UK here as well. We don't feel alone now. Yes. So Stephen Fry is someone who's known in the UK. He made this video some years ago, I think maybe 2 or 3 years ago. And it was some Irish guy who was asking him a question about what happens if you see God and whatever. I mean, he as many new atheists arrogantly replied, he said, if I saw God, I'd tell him what was that all about with the kids, the bone marrow and all that kind of thing. As if in his cosmic conception, Allah's just going to stand there or just wait for him to speak and he'd be humiliated by this man. Obviously, his cosmic conceptions can only be described as a figment of his own imagination. However, let's get to the crux of the actual argument that he's putting forward. And the argument he puts forward is, why is there suffering in the world? And more specifically, why is there suffering with children? And we've already kind of alluded to the fact that this was most prominently put forward by Epicurus in the Hellenistic period. It's about if God could intervene, why doesn't he intervene? But once again, just to repeat that point I made, that the assumption there, and this is almost universally recognized, not almost universally, but it's recognized on a massive scale now in philosophy, and that argument is a reductionist one, which doesn't consider the wisdom of God as an attribute and also the freedom of human beings as a reality. In fact, I've read many different atheist philosophers who say this. Why it is a powerful emotional argument? Why is it the case that we see kids with diseases and so on? And the answer would be, it's within Allah's plan. And we don't believe in the exclusive domain of the material world. So we believe in this world, the grave, the life of the grave, and then the day of judgment, and then heaven and hell. So these are 4 separate domains. And it's like the story of the 3 blind men and the elephant. I'm not sure if you've heard this story before, where one of the blind men come and they touch the elephant in the zoo, and they touch the ear of the elephant. They come back and they ask, what's the elephant like? They say it's a very wavy creature. The other one touches the tail and he's asked, what's the elephant like? It's a very hairy creature. And the other one touches the trunk, a very long creature. So none of the blind men know what the elephant is like, because they have a reduced experience with that elephant. They have a partial experience with that elephant. They have no idea what the elephant looks like from an outside perspective. And the same thing applies in this analogy to the child that's, for example, struck with cancer or something like that, because you could argue, you can see that that child is suffering, but if only you could see that that child will be recompensed and rewarded for that suffering in the afterlife. In this case, perhaps saved and so on. But in this case, you're seeing the whole elephant, or the elephant in its entirety. You're seeing the whole picture, not just the pixel. So, by virtue of necessity, any atheist, most atheists have a materialistic conception of God. But the irony of the reality is, they themselves have no explanation for that. Like, if you ask an atheist, on your worldview, on your materialistic worldview, how can you account for the fact that children have diseases and that these things are happening? And those atheists will say, if they're materialists, these are accidents that happen. They might be subjectively problematic or hurtful or painful to the human being, but intrinsically on an objective level, they don't have any value. In fact, you can even go further than that. You can say that atheists have no mechanism of determining objective truth. And from that perspective, as many of the postmodernists postulate, like Russell and Derrida and Nietzsche, if that's the case, you can't say that you believe in good and bad on an objective level. Evil does not exist on atheism, you could argue. So for that reason, it's only subjective. The evil can only be subjective, it's a social construct, and so on. So to deem that thing as evil is problematic on atheism, because then you have to prove it from first principles, which is almost impossible. Obviously, that's a philosophical task. Not many of the philosophers, moral philosophers, have actually tried to do it. Immanuel Kant is an exemption of that. Apart from that kind of conception, the atheist is forced into a corner because he's asking a question based on a presupposition that he doesn't even know how to prove himself. So with Stephen Fry, the 3 main questions I would have for him is, how can you prove the existence of evil in the first place from your worldview? How do you conceptualize the treatment of those children on your materialistic worldview? Is it in vain? Basically, are these children being tortured in vain? And number 3, I would ask him, why that you reduce God's attributes in your conception to maybe 2 attributes, not considering human free will and the wisdom